He lived 30 years as an anonymous neighbor, until a cake revealed his exciting billionaire secret. The metallic sound cut through the silence of that forgotten street, where the days passed slowly and no one expected surprises. Margaret dropped the broom on the floor and ran without thinking. Edith came out of the kitchen, still covered in flour, holding the plate with the freshly baked cake. In the middle of the sidewalk, the neighbor, that quiet man who was almost never seen, was sprawled near the garage, his arm twisted and his face pale. Nothing in his expression nor in the destroyed gate scared more than what came from the half-open door. A golden glow appeared on the doorknob, discreet but impossible to ignore. It was the first sign that this gentleman was not who he said he was. Stay until the end, because this story goes far beyond an accident and a plate of cake. What these two women discovered that day transformed not only their lives, but also that of a man who spent decades hiding the most generous heart anyone had ever seen. That street seemed made to disappear from the map. Small, silent, with old houses and low fences, it housed stories that no one else wanted to hear. The kind of place where the hours passed slowly and neighbors greeted each other with a quick wave before heading back to their backyards. It was there, in that unhurried setting, that Margaret and Edith spent a good part of their lives. Widows, retirees, inseparable friends and neighbors for decades. They had their rituals, like coffee in the afternoon at 4 and the trip to the bakery on Sundays. And right there in the house next door, there lived a man who was almost never seen, but who, without anyone knowing, would change the course of that entire neighborhood. No one imagined that that discreet and quiet gentleman was hiding a story that crossed the neighborhood's gates and reached the most powerful rooms in the country. It all started on an ordinary morning, when by coincidences of fate, Margaret and Edith were preparing to present their mysterious neighbor with a cake that Margaret had just baked. At that moment, the sound of a violent impact broke the silence of that nameless street. The gate of the neighbor's house had been hit by a runaway truck. The driver lost control on the curve, and the vehicle went straight into the metal, scattering shrapnel across the sidewalk. Margaret, who was sweeping dry leaves, dropped the broom and ran. Edith, who was making cornmeal cake, came out with her hands still covered in flour. The man who never said anything beyond a wave was lying near the garage with one arm bent strangely and his face pale. While they waited for help, time seemed to freeze. That man, who for years had been almost invisible, was now the center of attention of two women accustomed to silence. And it was at that moment that Edith, between shock and distress, noticed something strange. As she approached the door of the house, she saw a golden glow on the doorknob. It wasn't just any decoration. It was the first detail that revealed that there was something very wrong with that story. Margaret, nervous, saw the door ajar and went into the hallway of the man's house to get a towel. What she saw inside left her unresponsive. The house, ordinary on the outside, revealed a completely out-of-place setting on the inside. Antique, symmetrical furniture, intact pieces of porcelain on a dark wood sideboard, signed oil paintings and two gleaming bronze sculptures in the corner of the room. It wasn't just a pretty house. It was a house preserved with meticulous attention, where every corner seemed to have been maintained with extreme care and good taste. Edith entered right behind and locked the door. She felt a shiver when she noticed the Persian rug that covered the floor and the hardcover books that were organized in alphabetical order on an oak bookshelf. This was not the home of a lonely retiree. What was that man doing there? And most importantly, why did he hide so much of who he really was? On calmer days, he would appear for moments at the gate, with his hands in his pockets and his gaze distant. Once, when he saw Margaret struggling to hold 3 bags of vegetables, he discreetly crossed the street and helped her without saying a word. He just picked up the bags carefully, walked to her balcony, and left everything on the little table where she used to put her plants. Afterwards, he returned to his house as slowly as he had left. On another occasion, Edith noticed that the plants on the outside of the fence were always very green, even in periods of great sun. One day, she noticed that there were watermarks on the floor, coming from his side. He was the one who wet the leaves that faced the street, perhaps to keep the fence beautiful, perhaps out of habit, perhaps for something more difficult to explain. But none of that seemed enough to justify what the two friends would soon discover. Margaret felt a certain tenderness for that silent man. Since her husband passed away, loneliness was part of her home. The silence of the turned-off television and the empty chair on the other side of the table were memories that insisted on remaining. She decided, without much of a plan, to take a piece of cake to her neighbor on a cloudy afternoon. There was a knock on the door and it took him a few seconds to open it. He received the plate with a discreet wave and looked into her eyes for a short time, but long enough for her to notice something different. On that first delivery, he didn't say anything. But the following Sunday, the door was already ajar, as if he had been waiting. From then on, he began to leave the door unlocked on Sundays, and Margaret would leave the plate on the table in the entrance. They never asked each other for anything, but there was in that simple gesture a silent exchange of humanity that Margaret never expected to experience again. Edith watched everything with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She thought it was strange for someone to live in a neighborhood for so many years without saying anything about themselves. No name, no past, no story to share. She always said that no one was so reserved for no reason. She commented that that man was not just someone tired of life. There was something hidden, and she was betting on it. Sometimes she whispered to Margaret that he could be a fugitive, a retired spy, or someone trying to erase the footprints of his own past. But Margaret never paid any attention to it. She said that what mattered was how he treated her. A kind gesture didn't need to be accompanied by a resume. Still, the mystery grew between them like a shadow that slowly crept along, unhurriedly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that moment seemed to be closer than they imagined. The ambulance siren cut through the silence on the street while Margaret and Edith, still inside the house, tried to digest what they had just seen. Their eyes scanned the room slowly, as if they needed to confirm that none of this was imagination. Margaret, with the towel still in her hands, felt a strange discomfort in her chest, a kind of urgency that she didn't know where it was coming from. Edith remained motionless, observing the chandelier hanging in the center of the room, the polished wood of the furniture, and the faint scent of something expensive that seemed to permeate the air. When they heard the ambulance's tires stopping outside, they left in a hurry, without exchanging a word. The moment they walked back through the door of the house, they realized that something had changed inside them. The destroyed gate now seemed a metaphor for the barrier that had fallen between that man and the world. On the sidewalk, the paramedics were already organizing themselves. One of them pushed the neighbors away, asking for space with firm gestures. Two others knelt beside the stretched-out man, put on the neck brace, and began basic procedures. His face was still pale. There was a small cut on his forehead and light bleeding on the side of his arm. One of the rescuers glanced quickly toward the house and frowned, as if he had seen something that disconcerted him. Margaret handed over the towel, which was used to cover the man's shoulders before putting on the thermal blanket. The stretcher was positioned, and within seconds, he was already being placed in the ambulance. The equipment's wheels hit the asphalt with a dry sound, while neighbors whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. The question that no one asked out loud was the same one that echoed in Edith's head. Who was this man, really? With the ambulance long gone and the street trying to regain its usual appearance, Margaret and Edith remained there in no rush to return to their routines. The wind made the leaves spin on the ground, but what really moved the air was the discomfort in their thoughts. Edith stared at the hole in the gate and the wide-open door, as if waiting for someone to come out and explain everything. Margaret, more introspective, mentally relived the objects seen inside the house: the piano, the sculptures, the well-lit paintings, the millimeter arrangement of things, that impeccable organization, that good taste, that absence of carelessness, did not match the image of an ordinary man, and that bothered her. It bothered her because from that day on, nothing would be seen in the same way. The routine of the two ladies had been crossed by a mystery that was just beginning to reveal itself. The police car arrived a few minutes after the ambulance disappeared around the corner. Margaret and Edith were still in front of the house when the two police officers came down with serious expressions and determined steps. Neither of them asked what had happened. They looked straight at the house, then at the destroyed gate, and then exchanged a few words in hushed tones before one of them wrote something down on a small pad. The detail that caught their attention was the attitude of the police officers. There was no rush, no confusion. They seemed more concerned about the state of the house than the accident itself. One of the men quickly looked into the room before speaking into the radio. Edith crossed her arms and cast a suspicious look at Margaret, who just shook her head slowly, still trying to understand what was happening. That was when one of the police officers referred to the neighbor as Mr. Edward. The way he said the name, with firmness and respect, was what broke the ground beneath the two ladies' feet once and for all. The word came out naturally, as if this were a well-known and important figure, not just an ordinary man who had lived alone for so long. The other police officer didn't even question it. He just nodded and continued observing the place as if he already knew exactly who they were dealing with. Edith was silent, but her thoughts were spinning quickly. They had never heard that name before. For years, he had just been the quiet neighbor next door, and now suddenly, a name full of formality and respect came to light, changing everything they thought they knew about him. Are you enjoying this story? So take advantage now and check if you are already subscribed to the channel. We have many other exciting and surprising stories like this coming. Subscribe so you don't miss any. Margaret tried to break the silence by asking if the police needed any information. The younger man responded politely, thanked her, and said that they were just checking to see if the residents needed isolation. Too vague a justification for what they were seeing. Nobody isolates the house of a retired neighbor who passed out after an accident, not when it's a common occurrence. The conversation ended there, but the questions did not. Margaret could still smell the soft scent of the perfume from inside the house permeating her clothes. Edith looked at the police, then at the door, then at the street. That didn't make sense, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt that the accident wasn't just a scare. It was the beginning of a revelation that was still far from over. Once at the hospital, the news first arrived in whispers, passing from nurse to technician, until someone blurted it out to a relative in the hallway. The name, until then unknown to the ladies and neighbors, gained an almost unreal weight. Edward Whitmore. It was enough for it to be confirmed by a distracted employee for the entire hospital to transform. Doctors adjusted their posture. Security guards reinforced the entrances, and a director, who never appeared, was seen entering the hospitalization ward. The man who everyone thought was just a discreet resident of a quiet neighborhood now had his name associated with the biggest fortunes in the country. Who was he, after all, that man who swept the sidewalk with slow steps and helped with bags on Sundays? It didn't take long for reporters to discover the address, and the street was filled with cameras, cables, and microphones. Report cars parked in a row, producers shouted instructions, and curious neighbors huddled at the windows. It was as if the neighborhood had been transported to the center of national news. Helicopters flew over the region while journalists jockeyed for space on the sidewalk in front of the house where it all started. The same dented gates from the accident became the background for live broadcasts. The usual peace dissolved amid the buzz of questions and flashes. Even children stopped playing in the street, mesmerized by the movement that didn't fit in at all with the routine they knew. Margaret, sitting on the sofa with her hands clasped on her knees, refused every interview request. One reporter even offered money. Another promised to give a voice to those who knew the truth, but she only responded with a firm and calm tone. She said she had nothing to say, that he was the same man who had coffee with her on Sundays, who helped with the plants and smiled lightly when thanked for the cake. Nothing else mattered. It wasn't figures or scandals that would define that gentleman in her eyes. Edith, standing behind the window, watched everything with a tightness in her chest. The world was racing to understand who this man was, but perhaps what mattered most was precisely what he never said, and what would come next. No one on that block imagined. Edith could no longer sleep peacefully. As the journalist grew tired and left, she began to sink into a new kind of restlessness. The man who had gone unnoticed for so many years had become a personal enigma. She asked a younger friend who worked at the municipal library for help to look for old records, forgotten news, and information that could reveal something concrete. The two spent days combing through dusty newspapers, public archives, websites, and notary records. The more they searched, the more the pieces seemed to connect into a puzzle that challenged what she thought she knew about her own neighborhood. They found old reports of large donations made anonymously, always with the same discreet pattern. There were no interviews, no photos, just silent results. That reserved figure hit a trajectory that deserved to be told. One silent afternoon, when accessing a newspaper from 2 decades ago, Edith found the clue that tied everything together. A forgotten article talked about the tragic death of a teacher named Eleanor, victim of a cardiac arrest while traveling. The husband's name, mentioned only once, was Edward Whitmore. The article mentioned that she had grown up in a simple neighborhood in the capital, and that the couple often visited her old childhood home. When Edith saw the old photo of the mansion in the background of the image, she felt the ground disappear. It was the same facade, the same house where that man had chosen to live after his wife left. He hadn't just withdrawn from the world, he had returned to the place where they both started, as a silent attempt to stay close to her, even after everything. Have you ever heard a story similar to this? Tell us in the comments if you or someone you know has experienced something like this. Your story may inspire other people too, and it was in this search that Edith discovered what he never told anyone. Edward had donated absurd amounts to public hospitals, social projects, and orphanages spread across the country. He never signed with his own name. Donations were made by intermediaries or foundations that did not attract attention. There were no thank you plaques, no names engraved on walls. The numbers were revealed in financial statements and behind-the-scenes documents. The fortune he built throughout his life was redistributed silently, without any need for recognition. Edith closed the notebook with teary eyes. The man who had coffee with Margaret on Sundays was the same man who silently transformed lives, and even then, no one knew what the next secret he still kept was. In a few days, the secret that Edith discovered became public, and the calm facade of that previously peaceful neighborhood no longer existed. Television crews took turns at the door of Edward's house. Reporters fought for space on the sidewalk, where before there was barely any movement. The ladies began to receive letters, flowers, interview requests, and even invitations to talk shows. There were those who arrived crying, touched by the story of a billionaire man who chose to live among ordinary people without ever revealing the size of his own fortune. Emotion took over the entire country. Social networks replicated photos of the house, old videos of the street, and tried to create a profile of the man who had been invisible for so long. But amidst all this commotion, the two neighbors remained quiet, watching the spectacle with some discomfort. They knew that the man they knew did not fit in with that noisy exhibition. Margaret wasn't involved in anything. She refused interviews, avoided going out, and kept her routine intact. When she found out that he had woken up and asked for her, she didn't think twice. She separated a portion of the orange cake she had made in the morning and took the same bowl with a red lid that she used on Sundays. She grabbed a coat, fixed her hair, and went to the hospital without announcing anything to anyone. Edward did not want to speak to journalists, nor to representatives of foundations, nor to politicians who suddenly appeared. He just wanted to talk to the woman who, without knowing who he was, gave him coffee and affection when the whole world ignored him. When he saw her enter, his eyes watered. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the bowl in her hands and smiled with his whole face. Margaret sat next to the bed, held his hand, and they remained silent for a few seconds. It was as if the noise outside didn't exist. She took the lid off the bowl and placed the piece of cake on the napkin. He took it with a trembling hand, broke off a piece, and chewed slowly, with his eyes closed. Margaret watched him calmly. There was no fear, no strangeness. That wasn't new. It was just the continuation of a silent routine that the two had created without realizing it. She didn't ask anything. He didn't explain either. The simplicity of that meeting spoke more than any headline, but there was still something he needed to reveal, something no one on the outside could imagine. Margaret held her bag on her lap as she looked at him with moist eyes. The room was silent, and the soft light made everything more intimate. She took a deep breath and asked gently why he had never told her who he was. It took him a few seconds to respond. After so long hidden behind a simple routine, revealing anything felt strange. But at that moment there was no longer any reason to hide. He stared at her, without rushing, and said that this was the only place where they didn't see him as a name in a magazine or a bank account. There he was, just the silent neighbor, who received cake, watered plants, and listened quietly to the radio. There he was treated like a human. He didn't need to defend himself or prove anything. And that was exactly what he had been looking for so many years. A few days later, still with bandages and walking carefully, he was discharged. When he left the hospital, a van was waiting for him with tinted windows. In front of the house, the scenery had already completely changed. There were temporary fences, attentive security guards, cameras installed, and a line of cars trying to quickly record that return. Even so, he made sure to walk slowly to the rebuilt gate, without lowering his head. The house remained the same inside, with the objects in the same places. The smell of the carpet, the sound of the old clock, everything remained as before. But now there were too many eyes on that simplicity. Across the street, Margaret and Edith watched everything with a tight chest. They knew that the calm they had known might never return. They just didn't imagine what would come next. Later that afternoon, he called a press conference in the backyard. A tent was set up and reporters organized themselves in silence. When Edward appeared wearing a light suit and calm eyes, the hubbub stopped. He thanked them for their concern and said few words about the accident. Then he turned to the side and pointed at the two ladies who were slowly approaching. He said that amid so many years of distance and distrust, he had found two people there who looked at him with truth, and he added that this was his family, not by blood, but by choice. A silence took over the environment. Then timid applause grew until it became a commotion, but what no one knew was that he still had one last decision in mind that would change everything from then on. Without pomp or long speech, Edward still announced something that no one expected. Between cameras and microphones, he revealed that he would create there, right in that neighborhood forgotten by the news, a complete support center for the elderly, a space with medical care, cultural activities, daily meals and rooms prepared for those who could no longer live alone. And all of it would be named after the woman he had loved for so many years, Eleanor. She had grown up on that street, walked those sidewalks, and dreamed of taking care of simple people. He said he never got to do that while she was alive. Now, with everything he had built in silence, he could fulfill that old desire. It wasn't about charity, it was about dignity, about leaving something that made sense. The response was immediate. Children running between the cars stopped to listen. Local merchants who came out of their stores to watch the speech clapped from the sidewalk. A group of neighbors began to cry silently. But the moment that sealed everything was when Margaret and Edith were called to the stage. Among so many names, they were the ones he mentioned. Those two women who approached when there were no cameras, who saw a human being where everyone else saw only silence. He was grateful for the afternoons with cake, for the words that were never taken for granted, and for the care that saved not only his life, but also his soul. They received flowers, a symbolic plaque, and a long hug. At that moment, the entire neighborhood understood that they were facing something rare, a true recognition, coming from someone who finally no longer needed to hide. If this part of the story touched you in any way, enjoy it and leave a like now. This helps the channel a lot and shows YouTube that this type of content is worth spreading. Thank you for being part of this with us. The story soon went beyond the city walls. An independent film director who grew up in that region decided to record everything. He spoke to neighbors, gathered archive images, and told, in detail, everything that had happened since the day of the accident. The documentary was shown at festivals, gained repercussion, and brought more donors to the cause. In less than a year, the neighborhood received sidewalk renovations, new lighting, an expansion of the municipal school, and a restored library. The senior center got off the ground and became a reference in the state. But for those who live there, the most important thing was not what was built with money. It was a change of perspective. Now, everyone greets their neighbor. Now no one goes unnoticed. But there was still one last scene left. A final gesture, planned in secret, that Edward prepared in silence to transform everything once again. On the Sunday following the center's inauguration, when the spotlights had already dimmed and reporters turned their cameras to other neighborhoods, Edward discreetly organized a small circle of chairs in front of the house. He placed a tablecloth embroidered with his wife's name, Eleanor, on the wooden table and waited, with a slight smile, for the start of something he would call Edward's Cafe. Those who arrived were greeted with a piece of simple cake, made by Margaret, and a steaming pot of fresh coffee. The ladies of the neighborhood, who previously only passed each other on the street, now sat together to laugh, remember the past, and dream about the future. The house that was previously walled in silence became a meeting point, and the figure of Edward went from mystery to symbol of closeness. The gesture seemed small, but deep down it was the most important of all. Meanwhile, Edith, who had spent much of her life believing that her value was only in her homework, now had a key hanging around her neck and a new sparkle in her eyes. Every day she opened the door to the small community library with a care that reminded her of watering a rare flower. The shelves, previously empty, began to fill with donations from people who had heard the story on television. Children's books, novels, biographies, old encyclopedias, everything cataloged by her, who also taught the neighborhood children to take care of the books like someone taking care of a precious secret. The old routine, marked by silence and repetitions, was replaced by excited voices, curious questions, and a type of noise that only exists where life is pulsing. In the backyard where before only the wind could be heard, now laughter echoed. Children who had never seen a flower garden spent their afternoons there, drawing with chalk on the ground and listening to stories that Edward patiently told. He kept a box of old objects, and each of them had a different memory to share. He talked about his wife, the places they visited together, the dreams they built, and the mistakes he learned to accept. Little by little, those children began to understand that wealth was not in the magazine columns, but in the details of what one lives. It was there, in that once lonely space, that a new generation was being touched without even realizing it. And although no one knew it, one last envelope was still tucked away in the desk drawer, with names written by hand and a plan that would only be revealed on the right day. Edward began to walk along the sidewalks with a slower pace and a more serene look. He no longer avoided greetings or smiles from neighbors who previously barely noticed his presence. When he sat in the rocking chair in front of the house, passers-by already knew that there lived someone who had chosen to live simply, despite everything he had. Edith, who usually observed the details around her carefully, commented in a low voice that he seemed lighter, as if he were finally at peace. Margaret just nodded and continued mixing the cake dough. The truth is that everyone there knew that Edward had found a way to belong to that place, not because of the goods he owned, but because of the affection he received where no one demanded anything in return. One morning, the gate did not open. The coffee cooled in the cup that Margaret had placed on the balcony table, and the cake remained there, untouched. When Edith entered the house, she immediately knew something had changed. On the desk rested the envelope he had kept since the accident, with their names written in handwriting. Inside, a short and direct letter, with the delicacy that only he knew how to demonstrate. He said that this had been his real home, that he had never been treated with as much respect as there, that he didn't want tributes, just for them to continue being exactly who they were. And at the end, like someone who precisely closes a cycle, the sentence that dismantled them both: "Thank you for seeing me." Attached was a document transferring part of his inheritance to the two women who, without knowing it, changed the end of the life of a man the whole world thought they knew. The news spread quickly. Newspapers, radio, social networks. But the neighborhood did not become a tourist spot. It became a reference. Reports showed the story as a symbol that greatness can live hidden behind low walls and small gestures. The Center for the Elderly, Edward's Cafe, and the community library began to receive donations from all corners of the country. Children drew his face on school murals, and groups of volunteers began to replicate the model in other cities. But nothing could replace the calm morning when Margaret, sitting with the cup in her hands, looked out the window and saw the empty chair. She smiled with teary eyes and whispered that no one knew, but now the whole world remembered, and somehow he was still there. Whenever someone chose to truly see the other, which part of this story moved you the most? Leave your feelings in the comments. We really want to know how this journey touched your heart. This story ends here, but the emotions it awakens live on. If you felt touched by everything that happened with Edward, Margaret, and Edith, take this moment to like the channel and ensure that new stories like this reach you. A specially chosen video will soon appear on the screen, with another story full of humanity and twists. Next, you will see a collection of exciting stories that follow this same style. Just click and continue this journey with us. See you in the next video, with more surprising stories that leave deep impressions on those who watch.